Okay, and welcome to lecture 12 on atheism. So I have kind of a controversial quote here for the subtitle. Quote, all religions are equally sublime to the ignorant, useful to the politician, and ridiculous to the philosopher. And that is a quote from Lucretius, who was a Roman philosopher, so all the way back to ancient Rome. So there's been like a consistent atheistic tradition in the West that dates all the way back to the classical era. It was very uncommon, of course, during medieval Christian Europe. But you find in the West that atheism isn't like a new idea. So, atheism is the doctrine or belief that there is no God. Another way of articulating it is it's the disbelief in the existence of a supreme being or beings. So those are more like active ways of defining atheism. And it's important to make the distinction between atheism and non-theism. So you might remember Buddhism isn't always an atheistic tradition, but it's a non-theistic tradition, meaning that it doesn't feel the need to appeal to the existence of a god or a deity to understand what its earthly suffering and its cure, which is its focus. So non-theism is more of like a disregard for the concept of God, not as active as atheism, which is an assertion that there is no God. So some false assumptions about atheists. Atheists are often highly mistrusted in our society, which is still mostly a theistic society. So one is that atheists are just mad at God, and that's not true. I think some theists don't understand how it's even possible to not believe in a God, and they can't really wrap their mind around that, so they just assume that atheists are just mad at God. But we're going to talk about some of the philosophical arguments that have been used historically to argue for the existence of God and how atheists address those. So it's important to say going into this PowerPoint, there is no definitive proof for the existence of God. That does not exist. If you could prove the existence of God, a transcendent God, you would win a Nobel Prize. Like, no one is able to do that. That hasn't happened. There hasn't been some sort of grand supernatural gesture in modern history that we could all point to and be like, see, there's a God. So far, all the phenomenon that we observe is explained through natural phenomena. However, there's no disproof for the existence of God. There's no proof that God doesn't exist either. And we'll talk about this later. It's not logically possible to disprove the existence of a transcendent God. So there's no proof either way. So that leaves room where it is logically possible and rational to believe in God, and it is logically possible and rational to not believe in God. Another false assumption is that atheists are all Satanists. So there are different branches of a church called the Satanic Temple, and the Church of Satan, and Luciferian Satanism. Like, there are these movements, and most of them go back to the 1960s. Most Satanists are atheists. They do not believe in God, and they do not believe in Satan. The reason they practice Satanism is they see Satan as a symbol of anti-establishment policies and morality, of a symbol for someone pursuing their own pleasures and desires, whereas in our society that can be considered problematic. They're very sex positive as opposed to our society, which is very erotophobic. So they see Satan as a symbol of like personal liberation. And they see God as an oppressive entity and Satan as a rebellion against that established order. But they don't literally believe in God or Satan. There is one small branch of Satanism that does literally believe in Satan, and this is called Luciferian Satanism. And they literally believe Satan is a supernatural evil entity that exists, and they worship him. But the vast majority of Satanists, and Satanism isn't that popular, are atheists. However, not all atheists are Satanists or have anything to do with Satanism. It is a minority position among the atheist community. Atheists all hate religion is another false assumption. Excuse me. You can find some atheists that do despise religion, and that was a position that was made more popular in the last 20 years by what's called the New Atheist movement. And the New Atheists, who I'll talk more about later, do hate religion. They think it's inherently violent. They think it's stupid. They have what many people assume all atheists think about religion. When not all atheists hate religion, some just don't find it convincing that there is a God. So we can't make a lot of assumptions about them. There's a lot of diversity within the community. Not all atheists fit into one stereotype of how to react to religion. And then another common response if someone comes out, so to speak, as an atheist is that someone might respond, then where do they get their sense of morality if not from belief in God? So I think most people, most moral philosophers and moral psychologists that study morality would say that operating on a sense of reward or punishment, like you're going to heaven or hell, or there's a reward or punishment, as a reason for being moral, is a rather low and childish stage of moral development. Most adult humans are able to get to the stage of morality where being good and doing good feels good as social animals. And so this question sort of reveals that the person asking the question is not very morally developed. They're revealing that they need to believe in a supernatural God and a reward or punishment in the afterlife to be good. And that's pretty sad because if you look at the behavior of atheists, they're not more predisposed to crime. They're not out there murdering people and doing all these heinous crimes because they don't believe in God. That just doesn't happen. And in fact, a lot of them overlap with what's called humanism. And that involves a lot of philanthropy at times. So atheism and morality. Here's a ad in the United States. Why believe in God? Just be good for goodness sake. So again, it's just emphasizing that you can be moral and be invested in morality because it feels good to be good. It's rewarding. And we're sort of wired as social animals to want to create some sort of social harmony in our lives, and that might be the basis for morality. So a lot of people assume being an atheist must be terrifying. You don't believe there's some God out there protecting you. There's no meaning to things. There's no order. Makes us feel more vulnerable. But some atheists see it the other way. So here's a new atheist, Richard Dawkins, looking at a London bus ad. There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life. So a lot of atheists, rather than finding it sad and difficult to adjust to not believing in God and finding that to be a harder life than believing in God, many of them claim they feel relief, especially if they had been theists or believed in God at some point in their life. Because when you believe in God, you feel like you're being watched all the time. You feel like you're being judged all the time. Do we really pay, for those that believe in a reward or punishment in the afterlife, Do you really think about that all the time, that you're in danger of eternal damnation? That can be a very psychologically terrifying concept. And those concepts don't always occupy belief in, uh, accompany belief in God, but they often do. But the idea of being watched and judged all the time can be a very terrifying and burdensome concept and experience. So freedom from belief, it can be experienced just as there is freedom to believe. So now we're going to talk about some of the classical arguments in Western thought that have been invoked as proofs for God's existence, and how atheists have responded to them, and how none of these arguments definitively work. You can point out unsoundness or fallacies in all of them. However, that doesn't mean God doesn't exist. That just means there is no proof for God's existence, a transcendent God's existence. So the first one is called the first cause argument, and Aristotle was the first one to really formalize this. And this is the idea that everything that happens in this reality is part of a chain of cause and effect. And there had to be some sort of first cause that created it all, that set off the chain of cause and effect. So everything is subject to change and part of this chain of cause and effect, but there is an eternal, uncreated God who is the first cause for that chain of cause and effect. So you can respond to this by being like, well, who created God? Is it really convincing to just say, poof, there is an eternal, uncreated God? Like, how? That doesn't really make sense. And also there's a concept called Occam's razor, which means you go, when you're conducting a logical argument, you go with the simplest inference. And it's a simpler move. It's a more intellectually elegant move to just say the universe is eternal, that the chain of cause and effect is eternal. The universe might be in flux, but the flux itself is eternal. And that sort of fits more with modern cosmology. I mean, Stephen Hawking made the argument that it seems possible that we are living in the black hole of a larger universe. That there was a larger universe and there was a black hole, and a bunch of matter and energy got trapped in that black hole. And when it reached a certain density, it exploded, and that's the Big Bang. And we are living in the black hole of a larger universe. And there might be an infinite number of universes. That's called the multiverse theory. And that actually is pretty much what is accepted in Hindu thought and a lot of Eastern thought, is that everything might be subject to change and be impermanent and in flux in this reality, but the flux itself is eternal. There's no, to posit that there had to be a beginning to reality, even if everything in reality is subject to change, that's a dogmatic assertion that doesn't have any real reason why that would be a required thought. So there is no reason to assume that there had to be a beginning to reality. So the argument from design, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with this, that the complexity that you find in life had to be designed in like a top-down way. And of course, Charles Darwin came up with the theory, or didn't come up with the theory, but popularized the theory of natural selection, whereby you can explain the appearance of complexity in life in a bottom-up way and bottom-up processes, where if you understand the amount of time that has passed on this planet before the appearance of different types of complexity, that is more than enough time for that complexity to arise out of the process of natural selection, whereby random genetic mutations are selected by the environment to allow certain mutations to become popularized and survived, and that accounts for the diversity of life on the planet. So Darwin provided an alternative to saying there's a designer, that bottom-up processes can explain that. Natural processes can explain the complexity of life, rather than assuming there's a top-down designer. And something else to point out is it's one thing to think there was a designer and to believe in intelligent design, but it is a radical leap to say there is a designer and that designer is the God of the Christian Bible or the God of the Quran or the God of the Hebrew Bible. That's a total leap. And some philosophers, such as David Hume, have pointed out if there is a designer, it's not that great of a designer. There's a lot of flaws to the design. For example, human beings aren't very good at walking on two legs or being bipedal yet, because we haven't fully evolved in a way to adjust to that. So on a long enough timeline, every human being, every Homo sapien has severe back problems. And there are a lot of other really inefficient patterns to life that would explain that the design isn't perfect, definitely not perfect. So maybe it was, Hume argues, maybe there was a designer and this designer is senile, is what Hume proposes. It's more of unintelligent design. And then the argument for morality, which again is something like, well, then where do you get your morality from? How do you explain the existence of morality if there's no God to give authority to the concept of right and wrong? And this goes back to an ancient Platonic dialogue where Plato, the Greek philosopher Plato, writes a dialogue between Socrates and this character Euthyphro. And Euthyphro says he knows what's right because what is right is what is commanded or demanded of the gods. It's a divine command theory. And in the context of ancient Greece, it was easy for Socrates to poke holes in this by saying, well, there are many gods and they disagree with each other. So which god is the one that's correctly coming up with what's right and wrong? But then Socrates makes an even more interesting argument where if by definition what God says is good, by definition, and that by saying it's good, God creates that goodness, then God himself or herself cannot be praised for being good. There's no outside objective criteria for determining the goodness of God. So that's a limitation of divine command theory. Another possible solution is thinking of morality as like natural law, like the laws of physics that are able to possibly function without the concept of God. Another theory is social contract theory, where morality arises. It's a human construct that arises out of the need for human beings to get along with each other because it's easier to survive in groups. And that explains the whole enterprise of morality. And that's a version of saying morality is subjective. To say morality is objective would be to say it exists out there, independent of human thought and experience. But to say it is subjective is to say it's entirely a human enterprise. The universe itself is profoundly indifferent to our moral determinations. The universe is amoral or not imbued with right and wrong. It's totally human to impose that on the world. And that's close to what the Taoist sages said, right? Like they said morality is a construct that comes with civilization. But there can be like a balance in the universe, according to Taoist sages. So the new atheists, these were atheists that wrote in the last 20 years that were really well read and influential, but were very hostile towards religion, and why a lot of people assume all atheists are hostile towards religion because these new atheists made quite a ruckus. So the first is Daniel Dennett. He's an evolutionary biologist. He writes a lot about the mind-body problem or human consciousness and why there's not a soul. So that's kind of his deal. He also takes on, of course, creationist and intelligent design perspectives. And then you have Christopher Hitchens, who was more of like a historian and just talked about sort of violence in connection with belief in God through various theistic religions. So that was more his deal. Richard Dawkins was also an evolutionary biologist and does a lot of similar work to Daniel Dennett. And then Sam Harris, I never read any Sam Harris. He was more of just a philosopher, I think, that came from an atheist perspective, but you could look into that more yourself. But these atheists do not reflect the whole atheist community. And some atheists don't even want to be part of a community. So you can't just say all the atheists are hostile to religion, because that's not true. A lot of these thinkers are. But some of their hostility has been exaggerated too. I mean, Christopher Hitchens he died actually of cancer in the last like 5 or 10 years. But he and Richard Dawkins were extremely hostile towards religion. Daniel Dennett just thinks it's dumb and doesn't understand why people find it rational. And Sam Harris, I don't have a lot of experience with him, but he's grouped with the New Atheists. I'm sure he has some hostility as well. But not all atheists are hostile to religion. So, a lot of atheists are confronted with theists who claim that you can't disprove the existence of God, so you're not really an atheist. If you acknowledge the logical possibility that there could be a God, you're just assuming there's not, and you just lean towards there isn't. You're really an agnostic. Well, on the flip side of that, most theists have doubts. Most theists acknowledge the logical possibility that they're wrong about the concept of God. So everybody is mostly an agnostic, or someone that doesn't have the knowledge to make a perfect determination. And so Richard Dawkins calls it de facto atheism, where even though you acknowledge the logical possibility of being wrong, you overwhelmingly feel and think that there is no God. It's just sort of that atheists are often held to higher standards in terms of how extreme it is to make a determination either way than theists. So there's kind of like an imbalance or a double standard. Atheism and the afterlife. So we have another quote from Lucretius. He was the same guy that offered us the subtitle to this chapter. Quote, "To fear death, then, is foolish, since death is the final and complete annihilation of personal identity, the ultimate release from anxiety and pain." So he made the basic argument that if when you die, no part of you survives. There's no soul, there's no afterlife, it is just complete annihilation. There's no reason to be afraid of it, because there won't be a you to experience anything unpleasant, like either way. I mean, the only thing that makes death rough is that if it's the end, is that you leave people behind that will miss you. But they'll die too, so it's not a problem. So he says it's irrational to fear complete annihilation. And on the positive side, it's the ultimate release from anxiety and pain. You miss out on happiness and joy and pleasure, but to live forever might be hellish in itself. To experience consciousness and be a self-aware being forever might be terrifying. And as I mentioned before, some philosophers have pointed out believing in heaven and hell as a reward or punishment that undergirds everything that you do can be morally stagnating, because it can prevent you from transcending the reward and punishment stage of moral development and moving into being good for goodness' sake. So that's another argument that some atheists have made. So theodicy. So I actually spelled out the syllogism for you this time. We've talked about theodicy before. It's the problem of evil. So the syllogism goes, if God is omniscient or all-knowing, omnibenevolent or all good, and omnipotent or all-powerful, then God has the knowledge, because she's omniscient, that evil exists, and the desire, because she's all good, and power, because she's all-powerful, to stop it. Evil exists, therefore God does not exist. So theist responses have typically fallen into two categories. Some sort of greater good argument where if in allowing the existence of evil that affords human beings and God the opportunity to triumph over evil. And in that triumphing over evil, that creates greater good than if that evil had never afforded that opportunity to begin with. So that's a form of the greater good argument. Evil is an opportunity for the proliferation of greater good. The other type of argument is a free will argument. And this is the idea that God could stop evil, but prioritizes human beings having free will and the opportunity to be evil themselves and have that freedom over just eliminating evil. That's fine for an explanation for human evil or evil that is created by humans, like war or genocide, whatever. But that doesn't explain what some would call natural evil, like the death toll that happens by natural disasters or whatever, death. And so ways around that would be to say natural evil doesn't exist, like it's just a human perception, it's subjective. But also in Judeo-Christian mythology, you have the fall in the Garden of Eden, whereby because Eve made a bad choice and ate from the tree of knowledge, which was forbidden, that brought sin and death and natural evil into the world. So there is a way of responding to that. But a lot of theists just find these answers unsatisfying, completely unsatisfying. So I think it's important, if you are a theist and you are addressing theodicy, to not be insensitive to the extremes of suffering that some human beings and some non-human animals will experience in their lives. Some beings experience only suffering. And so when you say things like, evil gives you an opportunity to learn or whatever, that's not true for everybody. For like a child that's born malnourished and will know nothing but hunger and pain, it's not an opportunity to learn and overcome and be a better person. I mean, it's sort of like it's a articulation of privilege to be able to make that kind of argument that evil always affords an opportunity to learn. It's sort of insensitive to the extremes of suffering that are experienced by others. Atheism and meaning. So if there's no God, there's no meaning to life, right? So what is the point? But I think on the flip side, does religion address meaning sufficiently? So let's take Christianity, for example. What is the meaning of life from a Christian perspective? To praise God? What? It doesn't really answer that question. In fact, if I don't know the meaning behind why I exist, it's all the more pressing to believe I'm going to exist forever in heaven or hell. What will be the meaning to my life in heaven? What is the point? It doesn't really answer that. On the flip side, are questions of meaning actually meaningless? Is the idea of meaning a human construct? And Susan Sontag, a feminist interpreter, said, "A thing is a thing, not what is said of that thing." That meaning is just us talking about things. It's a concept that doesn't have any reality. And another way of addressing this is that meaning is created by human beings. It's not discovered. It's not out there for us to find. It's not objective. Meaning's created by accomplishing goals and building relationships, for example. And then that can be satisfying enough for many people. Theism and the falsifiability criterion. So it's been pointed out that if a hypothesis cannot be disproven, it is a poor hypothesis. And unfortunately, belief in a transcendent God cannot be disproven. There's no way to falsify the hypothesis that there is an invisible transcendent God. So Bertrand Russell pokes fun at this. He was a philosopher and mathematician by saying there is a giant flying teapot like orbiting around in our solar system, and you can't disprove that there isn't an invisible flying teapot. So there must be a flying teapot. And he says that's what people do with the concept of God. They're just more comfortable with the concept of God, so it doesn't seem as absurd as his argument. And similarly, a more modern version of this teapot hypothesis is this movement that's called the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster. It's also known as Pastafarianism. And this is a group of people that, in response to the claim that intelligent design must be taught in schools, they pointed out how it'd be as absurd to have their religious beliefs taught in schools, and they made up these religious beliefs that there is a flying spaghetti monster who's omniscient, omnipotent, and all good, that created the world and designed everybody, and that has to be taught alongside intelligent design because it can't be falsified. You can't disprove an invisible, transcendent flying spaghetti monster. So that's, you might see like bumper stickers and stuff with the flying spaghetti monster, and that's where it comes from. Atheism and fine tuning. So another dramatic attempt to prove that there is a God is to point out how there had to be almost an infinite number of circumstances in alignment for there to be life on our planet, and complex life at that. So for example, you needed a planet around this size, around this distance from a sun or star that is in its lifespan at the same stage as our sun. And you need even more specific things that you don't think about. Like you need a planet the size of Jupiter, about the distance that Jupiter is from our planet, to have a large enough gravitational pull to absorb most asteroids. You need the right temperatures. You need like all these elements had to be perfectly aligned for there to be life. And it had to be a God that fine-tuned all these things for that to happen. And atheist responds with what's called the anthropic principle, which is, it doesn't matter how mind-bogglingly improbable it was for complex life to develop on our planet the way it did. It just has to be possible. And if it's possible, we are coming from the perspective of it having happened. So it just is what it is. And it is possible. Like Darwin's theory of natural selection provides plenty of time for those processes to create complex life. So the anthropic principle is we're coming from the perspective of it happened, and it doesn't matter how improbable, it just had to be possible. And if it's possible, we're coming from that one perspective. And it's actually really cool, because from an atheist perspective, it is mind-bogglingly improbable. And that gives you a sense of awe and wonder that maybe you wouldn't have if you just thought this all happened by design. If it all happened by design, there's like less awe to it than thinking, like ironically, than thinking this all happened by accident. So that's There is some room for wonder and awe within atheism. So some questions. I mean, I'm not going to answer these, but what reasons are there for believing in God? It'd be interesting to see what you have to say. Should creationism and intelligent design be taught in public schools? Given that there is a substantial atheist population, should under God be taken out of the Pledge of Allegiance? And should in God we trust be taken off our currency? Many of you may not know this, but under God was not originally in our Pledge of Allegiance, and in God we trust was not on our currency until the 1950s. It was President Eisenhower that added the concept of God into these things, because it was during the Cold War and Russia, or the Soviet Union, was seen as these godless communists, and we were seen as these God-fearing capitalists. And so Eisenhower wanted to emphasize that, and so made these changes. So is religion inherently violent? It's my perspective that it's not, that it's the misuse of religion, but it'd be interesting to see what you have to say. And is religion the opium of the masses? So we're revisiting Karl Marx's criticism of religion. And then finally, is the future an atheistic one? So it would be interesting to see your responses to these questions. I hope your ultimate takeaway isn't like that this PowerPoint disproves God, but this PowerPoint says that is pointing to the fact that you can't disprove God and you can't prove God. So there needs to be some tolerance and respect of people that accept one hypothesis over another. And that is it.